Last month, the Houston Independent School District, the largest public school system in Texas and one of the largest in the country, released data showing it had lost nearly 7,400 students this academic year. This isn't a new phenomenon, but rather the latest figure in over a decade or more of declining enrollments at HISD and other urban districts across the country. With more student losses projected, HISD has said it is considering school closures for the 26-27 school year. But while the district is under capacity overall, not all campuses are seeing enrollments decrease. In fact, 60 of HISD's schools are over capacity, with enrollments exceeding 100%. 22 are over 120% of capacity, according to a new brief from our Center for Tax and Budget Policy. Now, how do we make sense of both declining enrollment overall and a significant disparity in campus utilization across the district? And how can we move forward to adjust resources in a way that best serves the needs of students? Joining me today to discuss are Bill King and Erin Baumgartner. Bill is a public finance fellow with the Baker Institute Center for Tax and Budget Policy and the co-author with Joyce Beebe and John Diamond of a recent brief that explores disparities in Houston campus utilization. Erin is the director of the Houston Education Research Consortium, which is a research practice partnership between Rice's Kinder Institute for Urban Policy and 8 Houston area school districts to guide data-driven, equity-minded policy. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Thank you both for joining me today, and Bill, I'll turn to you first. What does the data from the recent brief show about enrollment capacity in the Houston Independent School District, or HISD? How many schools are over? How many schools are under?
So there's 255 campuses in HISD, and we found that about 50 of them were more than 50% vacant. About half the campuses are 25% or more vacant. And this is fairly typical of a lot of big urban school districts. What's kind of unusual about Houston is they also have about a quarter of their campuses, 60 or so, as you mentioned, that are overenrolled and some very significantly overenrolled. So it's sort of this weird situation. It's not just a district in decline, although enrollment's been going down, but you have these disparities between enrollment that are pretty dramatic within the district.
And Bill, how do the disparities, both over and under capacity, sort out geographically within HISD?
So it's mostly campuses on the west side of town that are more enrolled and ones that are on the east side are more under-enrolled. If you drew a line that went up 288 from the southern part of the district into downtown and out 59 north, then basically everything on the east and south of that line, that's where you see most of the under-enrollment. And if you go on the other side of that line, you see most of the over-enrollment.
Erin, given this phenomenon and given the overall trend of some 40,000 decrease in the past decade, how do you make sense of the decline? Not where are the schools, but why? What are the determinants? Is it demographic? Is it income related? What's happening?
I think it's really a mix. When we're thinking about who can afford housing in certain places, a lot of students and families are enrolling in their neighborhood schools. That's a majority of the way that families are choosing where to go. And so to be in some of those areas that have high enrollment and have a lot of demand for schools are not always neighborhoods families can afford to be in. And so sometimes they move. And so when we're seeing the overall decline of enrollment in HISD, a piece of it is birth rate decline, but a piece of it is also folks moving to other places.
And are the other places within HISD, or is it out to Katy, to other districts outside?
Yeah, there's a lot of movement that's happening outside of the boundaries of HISD, and some work that we've done at HERC over the last few years trying to understand pre-K enrollment and how that's changed over time. One of the things we saw that pre-K enrollment dropped pretty substantially across the board during the pandemic. However, in the more recent years, there's been a pretty significant return to pre-pandemic levels, but there are certain districts who are exceeding the pandemic levels of enrollment, and those are more of the suburban or even further out than traditional suburban districts.
Okay, and a question, Bill, that I've raised with you previously, but I'll ask again for this one. Is there a connectivity here to people staying within the geography of Houston and HISD, but going to either private, parochial, or charter schools?
So we looked at that a little bit, and the Houston Landing had a pretty interesting analysis where they looked at the actual transfer records. It looks like of this 40,000 kids that have left the district, something like 50 or 60% are probably transfers to charters. And the rest of it is just a natural population decline in some of these areas. If you look at where we're under-enrolled, those are communities that have struggled with population, generally speaking. And so part of it, I think, is demographic. Part of it's the fact that public school has some competition now they didn't have, 20 years ago.
And that competition exists in all the districts. That is, all of the parts of HISD.
Well, there's certainly different places that they're around, but one thing that I was curious about, and we did a little bit of looking, was there does seem to be some association with the availability and proximity of a charter school to these under-enrollments. So I think there's some connection between, the fact that there are charter schools in those areas. Are they there because the schools were having problems or for some other reason? But there seems to be some geographic connection between where the charters are located and the under-enrollment.
But I want to follow up on that with both of you. Are the charter schools moving, do you believe, deliberately to areas where public schools, for whatever reason, aren't serving the community?
I think one of the things we see with charter schools is the audience of students that they intend to serve are students who have been historically underserved or underrepresented in terms of educational opportunities. And so charter schools tend to be, in some ways, a much less diverse population, but a higher proportion of economically disadvantaged or particular racial groups because of where they're opening up. But that's the intention of a lot of charter schools, is to do that.
So we'll go right from that discussion to the state legislature. It's considering a school voucher program that would allow families to use public funds to pay for private school tuition. A, is this going to pass? B, what's going to be the impact on public school enrollments in HISD and throughout the Houston region beyond HISD itself? Bill, you want to start with that?
I think it's going to pass. It looks like that. It's going to be interesting. I'm a little skeptical it's going to have a big impact on HISD because within HISD, we've actually had a choice program for a long time. You can move around, you can go to the magnet schools, and you also had a lot of good charters here. So parents that were motivated and wanted to move have had an alternative to go to. So I don't know that suddenly having this program is going to make a big difference. The one ethnic group that I think might be affected is there may be some Latinos that are devout Catholics who've wanted to put their kids in parochial school but couldn't afford it. I could see that causing some additional exodus.
And for our listeners, just to clarify, this proposed voucher program would include using public taxpayer funds for parochial religious education, not simply non-religious charter schools.
Correct. That's the way the bill's currently drafted, yes.
And I'll turn to you for your thoughts. Impact of this voucher program on support for public schools?
Whether or not districts lose, thousands of students each, and that has an impact on their overall enrollment, is one question, but I think the bigger question is what is going to happen for overall funding for public education. The amount of dollars that are going to be pulled into the voucher program to support the vouchers is going to have to come from somewhere at the end of the day.
And where is that somewhere?
Ultimately, it's going to have an impact on the allotment that is given to school districts for each student that shows up to their district.
Bill, will the taxpayers of HISD still be taxed for schools even with this voucher program?
Absolutely.
All right. So that will continue. You will be additionally taxed on top of that, or your current general taxes will be in part allocated for the voucher program.
Yes, so this comes out of general fund, which is basically sales tax in Texas. There's a certain amount of money the legislature is going to appropriate for public education. And right now, this is a very tiny, tiny fraction of the total that's going to be appropriate, probably $1 billion out of $90 billion or something like that. But I think public school advocates are worried this is the nose under the tent. That's always kind of been the concern, was going to be $1 billion this year and $5 billion next time and $10 billion the year after that. There's a lot of states that have these programs, and they've been fairly modest in their effect in terms of enrollment.
Let's talk about the physical act of closing an underutilized school. What are the budgetary implications of such a step?
Well, you certainly will save money if you can find a place to put those kids where you have under-enrollment but not as severe and be able to close those campuses. You save the light bill. You don't have a principal's salary. You don't have a nurse's salary. All those sort of overhead expenses go away. And a lot of these campuses are going to be in areas where you can probably sell the property and recoup some of the money. So there's definitely a financial benefit to doing it. The problem is that they're very unpopular. People like neighborhood schools. They're frequently in these neighborhoods. They're challenged. They're an economic engine for that community. You're talking about taking away some livelihood of some people. And so they are generally pretty ferociously opposed. Now, it's been sort of interesting that we had the closures up in Aldine and almost nothing was said about it. And there's been some other closures around the state with very little kerfuffle. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens here when it happens in HISD.
And Erin, you touched on this in a previous response, but with those closures, if they're affected, predominantly underserved and minority communities, are there enough charter and private opportunities for those communities to stay within the community and still have access to schools?
I don't think so. I mean, the role of public education is to be educating students who are living within their boundaries. And we can't rely on charters and private schools to fill those gaps. We know that when closures happen, as you said, they're disproportionately impacting certain populations, and it has negative implications for the later academic outcomes of those students who are moved to other places. And it's also showing a disinvestment in those communities.
And on that theme, disinvestment, Bill, what do the numbers show, if indeed they're conclusive, about the overall impact of school closures? Is that an accelerant, as the evidence would indicate, generally speaking, for further decline of these communities?
Well, these are generally communities that are already in significant decline, and this is just one indication of what's going on.
Symptom of, as opposed to cause.
You don't have grocery stores. These are communities that are struggling in a lot of ways. There's frankly some environmental issues connected with this. Some of these schools are in areas where we've had environmental problems that have cropped up, a lot of them on the east side around the manufacturing base. I think that the impact on families and kids, the outcome of that will be determined in large measure by how thoughtfully HISD goes about this. When you look at these schools, let's say we've got two schools in an area and they're both, 35% enrolled. Well, if we could consolidate those two schools, so one's 70% enrolled now, then it's going to have less impact than just saying, we're closing that and just go, find
What do you
anything.
expect, Bill?
Well, we'll see. Hopefully that's what they'll do. It's a tough job. It's not going to be a popular job, that's for sure. I grew up in Kemah, and, my mother went to Kemah Elementary. I went to Kemah Elementary. My kids went to Stewart Elementary. He was the principal when I was there, So you have that sort of pride in your local school, and every community's got that. And so you've got that aspect to overcome. But at some point in time, it just becomes an economic issue that you can't afford to keep them open anymore.
And on that point, can't afford to keep open. HISD's got a budget shortfall. $4.4 billion bond issue on the ballot last fall failed, although, Bill, you may want to discuss the reasons why you think that issue failed, which are not purely related to the substance of school closures or indeed HISD planning. The option of shuttering schools, is that in the end the most or the only sensible path forward?
I think you're going to have to reduce the physical footprint size. I think how you do that is really, really important. At the same time, we've got to also do something about these 60 schools that are over-enrolled. I don't think we can overlook that. That's as big, if not a bigger problem than having a bunch of schools that are under-enrolled. Somebody sent me a picture of the lunchroom at Bel Air, which is one of these way over-enrolled schools. I don't know how the kids get in there. I don't know how it's not a fire code violation, They were just crammed in like sardines. So we've got to work on both ends of this equation at the same time. But frankly, if you're trying to keep open a school that's really not viable anymore, you're taking some resources away that could be applied to solving the overcrowding problem.
Typically, in a situation like this for the oversubscribed schools, you build new schools because you can't always expand on the existing physical plant, schools that are there. Is there any such undertaking, building new public schools in those oversubscribed areas of HISD?
So there's not right now because there's no bond money to do it. But I think this is something we need to really think about carefully. The old model was you go out and put down some temporary buildings while you go pass a bond until you can get buildings built. But if you look at the underlying demography here and you think about, let's say in a high school like Bel Air that's way over enrolled, you want to go build a new high school. Well, a high school ought to last you 40 or 50 years. Well, in 40 or 50 years, that high school might be half empty or less based on where the demography is headed. I think we've got to think carefully about just immediately adopting an old model, or we're going to automatically go out and build a bunch of new schools.
So, Bill, you don't do that. You don't follow that old model for the reasons you've described. What do you do to relieve the overcrowding, oversubscription?
I think there's going to be a lot of use of temporary buildings, but I also think we've got to come up with some new paradigms. There's about 15 or 20,000 kids that are enrolled in HISD that don't attend the campus right now, or their classes are on a local community college campus. So maybe we think about some ways to shift these to other facilities. We got a couple of schools that went out and rented vacant office buildings and converted them into classrooms. I think we've got to get innovative in what can we do online, what can we do as far as finding other kinds of structures we could utilize without going out and building new stuff.
Can I add that I think one of the other important pieces about this is not just making sure we're meeting the needs of those over-enrolled, high-demand schools. The reasons why some of those schools are high demand is that they're what are, quote-unquote, the good schools, the places where families want to go to. And who are the families who have access to those places? They're the more advantaged families. So if we're only meeting the needs of the more advantaged families in our district, we're providing a disservice to the rest of students in Houston.
True. And I will add an additional complex factor here. Let's take those populations already present physically in those desirable or perceived desirable areas. Even for them, the public school opportunities are limited. There is an assumption that significant numbers of those populations will go to private schools of one type or another. This is a very unusual structure for a school district where even for advantaged communities, there is in the end inadequate public schools in their neighborhoods. The magnet school with lotteries and fractional acceptance rates, the private schools as an assumption, a matter of course. This is not a normal or typical environment, both for the disadvantaged areas and even for the advantaged areas, to stay in public schools in your community throughout the K-12 period. Is there a solution to this, both of you?
I don't think there's an easy solution to it. And again, I would just repeat what I said earlier, which is I don't think we can rely on old models to address this. I think we got to think about new, innovative ways to do this. And certainly what Erin said is true. A lot of these over-enrolled schools are in affluent areas, but there's also some that are not very affluent. I mean, there's some of these places that are just demographically, there's a lot of people, especially immigrants. There's just a big crowd of people there. So it's really hard to generalize this when you're looking at 255 different campuses. I was looking at 2 elementary school campuses over here in the South Park sort of area. There was one that was 125% enrolled, and there was one that was 35% enrolled. I wonder what's going on there, because they're a couple of miles apart. And why is one really high and one really low? So I think this is going to require a really thoughtful campus-by-campus analysis of what's going on and how do we solve this really on a very micro level.
Bill, why was the bond issue defeated?
Well, primarily it was the unpopularity of the state takeover and of the superintendent. There was some buzz out there about the fact that why are we spending $4.4 billion on a district that's losing enrollment all the time? That's kind of the group that would have always voted against it. I actually chaired the bond campaign for HISD in 2012. And so you basically have 3 groups. You've got one group that's always going to vote against it. You've got one group that's always going to vote for it. And then you've got the persuadables in the middle, roughly speaking. And what the district did not have this time was that third that always votes for it. The teachers, the teacher unions, the PTO, the parents, all them, they were mad about various things.
The Mike Miles issue.
Yeah,
right.
So they were not going to vote for it. It was a protest vote for them.
If a bond issue is resubmitted, do you expect it would pass? And if it were to pass, how much would it do to address in a constructive, strategic fashion the issues that we've been discussing here?
Well, the way bond issues are passed is they come up from the grassroots. You go out and you survey schools and you convince people in that area that this needs to be done. That was not how this bond issue was put together. It was a very high-level review, and then it was kind of announced. That's what's going on. In the 2012, when Terry Greer was here, we spent 2 years assessing campuses and talking about various things. And we did things that were going to be specifically attractive to different neighborhoods. And I'll give you a great example. We were talking one day about what is HISD missing, and I brought up the fact that, we don't have an energy high school. We've got a medical high school. We've got a performing arts high school. But we're the energy capital of the world. We don't have an energy high school. And Terry goes, oh, my God, you're right. And so he went out and talked to all the oil companies, and they got behind it. They put it over in the first, I guess it's the third ward where it's in, over there kind of TSU in that area. And it was a very popular idea and helped get the bond passed. So you've got to think about what's really going to motivate the community to vote for it. If you just lay it out in sort of antiseptic presentation that we got this under enrollment, we got ACs that need to be fixed and all that, this just doesn't resonate with people.
Last word?
I think that it's about community buy-in and not just selling it to the community, but including the community voice in the process. And that's what feels like it was missing from this part of the process.
Thank you both. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. To read the new brief by Bill, Joyce, and John on declining public school enrollment in Houston, click the link in the show notes. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more about our work. Thank you for listening.